So, happy Memorial Day weekend, happy Memorial Day Sunday, and today's prayer part 2. A few weeks back, I looked it up, it was March 23rd, we talked about prayer another time in the Gospel of Luke. We took a look at Luke chapter 11, where we find words for the Lord's Prayer, and then we find some little other stories about how to pray. And one of those stories, if you might remember if you were here that Sunday, actually Oben was in Time for Discovery. And do you remember the week Oben was in Time for Discovery and he was the good father? And the children wanted fish. And was he going to give his children a snake or fish? And it was saying, just like a good father, if your children want something, you're going to feed them. So it was an example of God's goodness and how God listens to our prayers and wants to give us good things. So we had quite an interesting discussion of prayer, March 23, and people shared tidbits about prayer and what prayer meant to them. It was a tour de force discovery. It was really great. And it gave me the thought of, boy, if we get another shot at talking about prayer, that'd be great. And I knew Luke 18 had stories of prayer. Luke 18, verse 1, it opens with prayer and about being persistent in prayer. There are 3 stories you could say that are about prayer in 18, and we're doing two of them. The first one, I'm kind of regretful that we're not doing it, but the first story is about a widow and an unjust judge. And in that story, the widow is persistently trying to bug the unjust judge for justice and finally gets justice. So I love that story. Another example of persistence in prayer. Maybe some other year we'll take a look at that widow and that unjust judge story. Great story. The stories that came to life here, number 2 and number 3, the story is a story of, you saw it, Jesus gives an example between a Pharisee and, did you catch who the other person was? Tax collector. So it's called a parable. So Jesus is imagining this story between a Pharisee and a tax collector as 2 examples of how to pray. And then the third story in Luke and the second story in our example today featured, a blind beggar. And you might think, well, how is a blind beggar an example of prayer? Well, as we'll see today, what the blind beggar says is actually parallel to what the tax collector says. So it's actually a form of prayer. So that's our little introduction. Let's dig in a little bit more about prayer, because I was surprised where the stories took me today regarding prayer. So I think I got my first PowerPoint chart here to let's analyze this story about the Pharisee and the tax collector. So Jesus has 2 examples of prayer. There's the Pharisee. The Pharisee says, thank you. That's always a good place to start in prayer, right? Gratitude. Thank you. But then notice what the Pharisee is thankful for. I'm superior. Okay, that's my summary. I'm superior, and that person is inferior. And then the Pharisee says, look at me, I fast, I tithe. That is the Pharisee's prayer. So exhibit A. Then the other example of prayer is a tax collector. The tax collector seems to be at the fringe. They're at the temple, and it says the tax collector stood far off, so he's kind of at the fringe. His head is down, and he's beating his chest. I think it just shows just frustration. And he says these words, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. So that is a different example of prayer. So, I didn't warn you. What do you think? Example A, example B, or example 1, example 2? Which prayer do you think is better? Okay, audience participation. B, and why? Why is B the better prayer? Humble, praying to God, and not about himself. That's kind of interesting. Hello, self. You are so amazing. No, I mean, sometimes we need positive self-talk, but other thoughts about what makes the second prayer better? Asking for mercy. What does that imply? He needs forgiveness. We're all sinners. So, what might, the reason Jesus has to make this example makes me think, why might people have been confused about what is good prayer and what is not great prayer? What might be confusing to people in comparing these two prayers or these two people? Why might people have needed some guidance about what was the right way to pray? Well, the one was a Pharisee. What, say that? Pharisees in a power position. Had training about God. And thought, well, more important in the society. So would that be confusing to people? They're supposed to lead. So because the person was a Pharisee, people would have thought, well, whatever they're doing is fine because they're the ones with power and they know the Bible and they say the right things and oh my gosh, look at all they're doing. And how about the tax collector? What would have been kind of confusing for people the tax collectors were not well liked. So they were looked down upon. So it'd be kind of confusing. So Jesus was trying to help people see through to the truth about prayer. So maybe it's just saying prayer is not obvious. Prayer has maybe a political aspect to it, or maybe an aspect of wisdom. Not all prayer is alike, and we can use our critical thinking skills and not just whatever the surface says or whatever a certain person is. I was thinking it might be confusing too, because if the leader is saying, look how great I am, and then pointing a finger, look how inferior that person is, you might think, you might make the same conclusion. Well, the leader says they're superior, so they're superior. And if they're scapegoating somebody else, you might think, well, yeah. So you might hop on to that conclusion. But Jesus is trying to get his listeners to think and distinguish, even in the realm of prayer, what is true and what is false, what is helpful, and what is not a great thing. And the story really underscores it. At the beginning of the story, it gives you a big clue. It says, this is a story about people who are self-righteous and contemptuous. Contemptuous is a big word for hate. So this is a story about people who are they think themselves are so great, and they hate other people. And then if we needed more clues about right and wrong, the story says, the humble shall be exalted, and the exalted shall be humbled. And also in the story, Jesus says, the tax collector is the one who went home justified. And justified in this case is a beautiful word for healed, one with God. The tax collector is the one who is one with God. So let's see what the next little slide is. Let me remind myself. Okay, so just trying to do another little analysis of this, because, it's a story, and then you think, can I apply this? Not just in prayer, but in real life. I think prayer is connected to wisdom and discernment in real life. So there's a situation, and then within the situation, there is a perception. So let's tease this out, again, to help us all develop critical thinking skills, discernment, wisdom. So the Pharisees' perception is that he is superior. Then you can ask yourself, because I think this story is told for us, the observers. You can ask yourself here or in other situations, is that a distortion? Is that the truth, or could there be a distortion going on there? And then you can have wisdom for that situation. Because not everything in the world is obvious. Not then, not now. So we have skills, and I think prayer is a skill that helps us discern right and wrong and helps us see through things that are phony or just not quite right. Is there a we can say, is there a distortion there? And Jesus says a lot of times it seems like distortion comes from our mindset. And maybe our mindset is we're superior. Not a great mindset for, from that mindset, facts, analysis, and conclusions could also be distorted. So then walk it back to the tax collector. The tax collector's perception came from a humble place. The perception was that the tax collector needed God's mercy. And Jesus is saying that perception is a truer perception. And from that basis, it's a source where you can go from that to collecting facts and collecting analysis and making conclusions and acting on it. So Jesus wants us to walk things back to whatever a source, whatever a person, whatever a situation's mindset is. Is it a mindset of humility, or is it a mindset of superiority? It got me thinking about other things that can distort our perception of things. Number one, we're all human. Yes, we are all human. We are all broken. We all have a certain level of distortion. So number one, learn that in church. But do not despair. We also have grace. But there's another level of distortion that I think it's helpful for us to think about. So other forms of distortion. If you're in a position of authority a lot and people are, sucking up to you, that can distort you. Like power can corrupt. Money can corrupt. A position that you have can corrupt you. And that can distort your perception, that you may think that you're more correct than you are. And it can be self-reinforcing. And there's something about maybe if you're in a more humble position, it keeps you closer to the truth. You're a human being, you're broken, and you need help from a merciful God. That is a perception that is more accurate. And from that second perception, you maybe can collect facts a little better. And from good facts, or looking at information, you can analyze a little better, maybe draw conclusions, and take action a little better. I was thinking sometimes in our lives, we're just presented with conclusions. Someone comes up to us, my hair's on fire, this is terrible, that person's terrible, this situation's bad. And, a lot of times we like to bash social media, but people are people. So sometimes all we hear is the conclusion, oh, this is terrible, and that person's terrible, and that's awful. But Jesus is giving us a toolkit. Okay, well sometimes it is terrible, yes, and we need to comfort our loved one, and we have enough data, and we know patterns, and there's enough trust that we need to render aid. But Jesus is giving us a toolkit here to say, don't just hop on the crazy train of a conclusion. Like, look, I fast, I tithe, look at me. Jesus is like, not so fast. Be prayerful. What is the source? What is the mindset? What is the state of the soul? What is the goal? Walk it back to that. Is there a humble thing going on, or is it a cover-up? Is there ego? Is there trauma? Is there manipulation? Is there control? So we have a toolkit, critical thinking skills, useful for us so we don't just jump on a crazy train. And I think for those of us who are able to just calm down and walk it back and look for humility, hello train, the train is underscoring the importance of this. The crazy train. Let's jump on the sanity. You guys can be the sanity train that takes a little more time, a little more calm, and maybe gives you some wisdom about distortions that can make us not know the truth. So, okay, I'll go to the next slide there. It hit me. Perception has been a huge topic in Bible study. We keep noticing when we read the Bible, there's all this stuff about perception, whether we see, whether we can hear, whether we can think clearly. So, huge topic. We'll hit it again some Sunday. But it reminded me of a prayer that Joyce reminded us of. When you did, was that last year or 2 years ago you did Camino? 2? 3? I don't know. It just seems like it was not that long ago. But Joyce had a prayer, I think, associated with her walk across Spain. And it's a prayer that is associated with, I think it's Richard of Chichester, St. Richard of Chichester. It's also in the musical Godspell. There's a song with these words. So I thought, my gosh, I think this is a prayer for accurate perception of a situation. May I see thee more clearly, love thee more dearly, follow thee more nearly, day by day. It's not over, day by day. So, and it starts with clear perception. Walk it back to your source. Do I see clearly? Humility. Not assume what people say is accurate. Look at the heart, the intent. Is there trauma? Is there some brokenness there? That can help us collect facts correctly or look at the correct information and analyze. But, and this just loving God is a big one. And then from that, we follow. Well, I thought one question you might have. So if the basis for a lot of prayer is humility, 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 and not grandiosity, humility, what about that blind beggar? So let's jump to that second story. So in the blind beggar story, let's jump to the next shot there. The blind beggar story. So first of all, is that a prayer story or not? The blind beggar says, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. He says it twice, actually. And then it's just kind of interesting to note that the tax collector says, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Very parallel prayers. And this is also the basis for the Jesus prayer, which has been around hundreds of years. So if you are looking for prayer words, by the way, there's the prayer we just did, help me see more clearly prayer. And now here's another prayer. If you're looking for a prayer, just to have a phrase to say, this is the Jesus prayer. And it's rooted in Jesus' name and rooted in mercy for yourself. So you can repeat that. It's a meditative prayer that you can say over and over again. So just kind of interesting in this chapter 18 that two different characters are saying that prayer. So the blind beggar says the prayer, and then did you see what the crowd says to the blind beggar when Jesus is walking by? What does the crowd say? Shh. Pipe down, blind beggar. Pipe down. Who are you to call out to Jesus? And what does the blind beggar do next? Does he go, oh, I am but a blind beggar. I better shush my prayer. He yelled even louder. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. He yelled even louder. That doesn't sound very humble. Okay, audience participation. Explain that to me. That doesn't sound very humble. How come he didn't shush himself? How come he yelled his prayer louder? How do you what's your rationale? He trusted in Jesus. He knew Jesus could help him. Any other thoughts there for, well, that's not being humble. How come he's being so loud? Sometimes you got to be loud to get attention. He didn't care who saw him. He didn't care who heard him. He knew what he needed to do. Yeah. Oh, he was loudly saying, I sinned. He was putting it out there that he was a sinner. He wasn't trying to act superior in his loudness. Other thoughts, very, very interesting thoughts. Anything else you want to throw out there? Speak over the crowd. So he could, because the crowd was preventing him from Jesus. They were the problem. So one other thing I'll throw out there and let the discussion continue later was maybe perhaps prayer starts with humility. You start with humility, which has a better chance of having a good perception. But after you go through that process, trust the fruit of your prayer. Trust the fruit of your prayer and do not doubt. Because the next stage of prayer is courage to act. The courage to act no matter what anybody else says, what anybody else does, even if you are cursed by the crowd, have courage of conviction that the prayer and the insight and the truth that you have been given is valid, and cling to that. One of the neat things that came up Wednesday was John noticed in the blind beggar story that the man asked to see again. So it propelled me to pull out my Greek Bible, my Greek dictionary, and my Greek reader's guide. Does it really say see again? And it kind of does in Greek. But our English Bible, some said see again, some said see, as if it was for the first time. So we got into an interesting discussion there. Here's what I thought today. The beggar was saying, help me see again. I think it's a prayer for the crowd. Help the crowd see again, because their perception is distorted. They think this guy doesn't have a voice and doesn't have license to address Jesus. So maybe that's a good prayer for all of us. Lord, help us see again. Help us see the way you want us to see at creation. Beauty and love and goodness, the way your kingdom is. Help us see that again. Clear away our distortion. Help us see the way you see. In Jesus' name, amen.